Welcome back. I know I mentioned Edie Stewart was going to join me after the break. He's getting a connectivity issue, so we actually put Martin, who will join me now on the Zoom line. Martin George, attorney at law. We basically did a flip, brought Martin up a little bit earlier to dive into a very serious discussion going on right now, where we're seeing the DPP, well, at least more the PM, as we see in local parlance and words, pelting and throwing talks almost for the DPP. Now, if it's something I remember, Martin, you mentioned to me, and I took some notes in that regard, because when you speak, I always take my notes and I try to get my legal understanding of these matters. You would have mentioned to me that the current financial dependency of the DPP is more or less under the purview of the Attorney General. And I'm thinking for any changes to be made, for that true independence, because his office is supposed to be one that is independent and free of any political intimidation, as it were. That must be sorted out. And I understand also that his staffing, that is also controlled by the cabinet in terms of the DPP staffing. The cabinet is more or less the ones that govern the staffing. So let me just say good morning, and let's start from those points in terms of how can that scenario, if indeed it is true based on, well, I mean, you told me that some months ago, that must be adjusted.
Yes, and I think that's part of the problem, because, I mean, the fact of the matter is that although the office of the DPP is independent, the DPP himself is not his own man in his own house, basically. So he has to rely on others to provide the financing. He has to rely on others to provide the staffing that he requires. So he may put in a request for staff, but the point is you have to jump through hoops. You have the JLSC that has a role to play in the appointment of certain officers. So the fact of the matter is that he does not have that level of control. So while he may wish to have a better complement of officers, the problem is that you still have the bureaucracy that makes it hamstrung from time to time.
What's your take on that, as it were, I don't know, say impasse, it might be a strong word, but the whole issue where the PM in a statement last week addressing his supporters would have been critical. He called out the DPP, as it were. What's your thought of that particular development? Martin?
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, it seems to have been, Jason, a direct fallout from the DPP's decision to discontinue the PRCO case with Mr. Basdeo Pandey, his wife, Oma Pandey, Carlos John, and Ishwar Gwalbaran Singh. So it appears that the Prime Minister has decided, well, look, he has to shine a light, or as you say in the local parlance, he has to shine up the DPP, because, in other words, I think the government does not want to make it appear that they are the ones responsible for the collapse of the case. So I think, the Prime Minister seemed to turn his guns and train his guns on the DPP, and, I mean, this was exacerbated subsequently by the Attorney General's statement, where, I mean, if, from what I saw in the media, the Attorney General actually made a clear and direct criticism of the DPP himself. He said that, the complaint about understaffing is not an excuse to, explain away the underperformance of the DPP. The Attorney General was categorical in that statement, what I saw reported, if the reporting is accurate. So it seems that, they are basically putting the DPP as the fall guy for the ultimate responsibility for the collapse of the PRCO cases. So therefore, they are trying to ensure that nothing falls on the government in terms of blame or responsibility in that regard. I guess
it's all politics at play, and I wonder if, with all this politics playing out in the public domain, if it will impact the image of the DPP. And is the DPP, is criticism towards the DPP something that is, I would say, it's a non-entity really? Is it something that, you know, you don't really go down that particular road? Is he void, or his office is in a certain place where you cannot, as a public official, criticize him?
Well, I mean, the office is not immune from criticism, and we must still remember, Jason, I mean, the case I love to cite, the 1936 Privy Council case of Ambad versus Attorney General, where it was stated that, you know, by Lord Atkin, that justice must not be a cloistered virtue. She must be allowed to suffer the harsh yet respectful scrutiny of ordinary citizens. So, you know, it's not that the DPP can remain in an ivory tower, immune from criticism or immune from the public comment in terms of the dispensation of criminal justice. However, we must remember that while it is that he is an independent officer, he is not entirely independent when it comes to his financing, his staffing, you know, even maybe his housing, you know, because there may be issues in relation to that, because I know the Prime Minister did raise the issue of the $45 million in rent being paid for this building that is not being used. But then I saw another story which seemed to suggest that it was the special branch of the police service who had made certain requirements for the security issues, and those had not yet been sorted out. So if it is that the DPP has to await the approval or confirmation from a special branch as to, you know, before they can move into the building, then it may be that that, again, is something that is out of his control. You know, of course, I guess he can probably take the decision to override them and say, look, you know, I really don't need all of this extensive layer of security because, I mean, the reality is, you know, I mean, the Prime Minister's office is not protected by bulletproof glass. The President's house is not protected by bulletproof glass. If you understand me, the Chief Justice, you know, his residence or his quarters are not protected by bulletproof glass. The Hall of Justice is not protected by bulletproof glass. So, you know, you may ask yourself whether that is really a necessary requirement in order for the DPP to be able to, you know, go into the building. So, I mean, I guess at some point he may have to take the bull by the horns and decide, look, special branch or not, or whatever the recommendations are, I am going to occupy it because, of course, you have to be mindful. If it is that you have $45 million of taxpayers' money being spent on the building, and you are not getting, you know, any use or value for it, then of course that ought to be a concern for any responsible public official. So I think that now that, as I said, the Prime Minister has shone the spotlight on him in that regard, I would imagine that we would see some movement or traction in that regard, in that area.
Well, at least from tomorrow, we could safely say it's a step in the right direction because I recognize the criminal bar and the criminal bar, they have welcomed this meeting between the AG and the DPP. It's going to happen tomorrow. So I trust coming out of that meeting, man-to-man, face-to-face, probably issues could be trashed out and there could be at least the start of some healing, as it were.
Well, we hope, Jason, that the meeting will occur, because the reality is that, you know, the DPP as an independent official, I mean, and his post is constitutionally enshrined, we have to ask ourselves whether it is that the Attorney General has the power to summon him to a meeting. You know, I would imagine that, of course, the Attorney General can at any time invite him to a meeting. But let's not forget, years ago when there was the standoff, if you recall, Jason, and you know, I always love to remember the history because, you know, we seem to have such short memories in Trinidad and Tobago. You remember when there was the face-off between then DPP Jeffrey Henderson and Chief Justice Ivor Archie, you know, and, you know, Mr. Henderson was summoned by the then Chief Justice. And the DPP said, well, you can't summon me. You know, I am an independent office holder. you know, you could probably invite me to a meeting. We could arrange a mutual date, time, place, etc. But you can't summon me. And, you know, I mean, the way the headlines in the newspaper played out over the weekend, it did appear almost as if, you know, you were calling in a naughty schoolboy into the principal's office, you know, to give him, you know, some sort of punishment.
Yeah.
So I hope the meeting does take place, but we have to remember in the context that there must always be that respect shown for independent office holders on either side.
Yeah, and on that level too, when we're dealing with professionals, people who are well studied, people who are respected in their field, you know, the optics must be correct, the wording, the mood, you know, it must be correct.
That's right.
Yeah, protocols can be. You must adhere to protocols, you know, because people will.
That's right.
They will pull their rank. They'll say, "Who are you talking to?" You understand?
Right, and of course, you know, in Trinidad and Tobago, egos get in the way of many of these office holders, you know, and they tend to lose sight of the bigger picture. And, you know, they feel that, you know, you can't call me to a meeting, you know, and they stand on ceremony and stuff like that. So,
Martin,
we hope that doesn't happen.
Well, I want to move on to the THA appeal dismissed, but I'll tell you this, right in Citygate, I mean, don't even have to be big office holder, people on the groundsman. Who you talking to? You can't call me just so. So I could only imagine with office, it's amplified. What's your take on this THA appeal being dismissed? I know that, of course, issues out of Tobago are very close to your heart. I just want to get your perspective on that one. Go ahead.
Yes, yes. While it might appear to be an academic point and, you know, one that is really just an, you know, an exercise in, you know, a theoretical debate or discussion, it is a valid and important issue that needs to be addressed, because the reality is that you have to consider what the provisions of the THA Act say. And you have to consider that, look, if it is that you are not supposed to be employed otherwise once you are holding the office of Deputy Chief Secretary, then the question would be whether Mr. Duke, when he was appointed as Deputy Chief Secretary, whether he violated those terms by also then still being president of the PSA and also a member of the Registration, Recognition and Certification Board. So, you know, and both of those offices carry remuneration. So in other words, you are not supposed to be, you know, in any office for remuneration while you are holding that office. So it's important for the court to determine and pronounce on that. You
know, does this set a precedent, really, in the THA for other members? Because I recall if it's something, I don't know if it's something similar, what happened with Jack Warner when he was vice president of FIFA and minister in, of course, the People's Partnership, and there was that call for him to leave the football aside, which he eventually did, of course. You know, I kind of, that's the only one within recent history I could kind of recall one person kind of saddling both places where both were very important roles and functions. But does this set a precedent as we look towards the THA and other members?
Well, I think when the court makes a decision on it, it certainly will, you know, because it gives the interpretation in terms of the legislation, and we will now know how it is to be treated and applied. So it certainly will be a precedent once the court gives a decision. But remember, the matter is only now going to be ventilated, because what had happened is that Mr. Duke and Mr. Augustine, when they were good, when they were riding partners, saddling horse together, they were the ones who had appealed, they had objected to the matter being heard because they said that it was a frivolous point, but the judge dismissed that and said, no, it should be heard. They went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal has now dismissed their appeal, so they're now going back to the judge to actually have the substantive arguments on the point.
So this is more or less to do with people who are in positions of governance, because I've heard and we have seen where folks who are on the opposition side can still continue their practice. So let's say someone is a sitting MP or they're representing an area, let's say in THA, let's say in terms of the minority leader. I suspect he cannot just depend on his minority leader compensation to survive. I'm sure whatever his vocation is, he will still practice in that regard. I would imagine this is really to do with those who are actually in the seat of governance. You have to, like, put everything else aside. You have to just focus on that job.
That's right. So it applies to the secretaries and the chief secretary and the deputy chief secretary. Okay. So those are the offices that are the ones that you must, only focus on that in terms of remuneration.
But everybody else could, let's say, if somebody's an engineer, if someone is an architect, they could continue with their vocation and practice and still fulfill their role within the THA, right? Martin? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I'm asking.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
So I'm saying outside of the positions you just mentioned, where the chief secretary and deputy chief, anybody else can still fulfill their role under the umbrella of the THA and practice their vocation at the side, whether they're an engineer, architect, lawyer.
The secretaries, the deputy chief secretary, and the chief secretary. Those are the offices that you cannot have another calling or profession for pay or remuneration. Okay. But the others are able to.
Okay. Okay. Understood.
Yeah.
Understood. Well.
Yeah. So it's similar to the national parliament, where the ministers of government, you cannot have another form of employment once you're a minister of government.
But once you're a backbencher
if you are just a normal MP, you could.
So if you're a backbencher or MP or you're opposition MP, you can indeed continue with your... Correct. Yes, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
Understood.
Yes.
Understood.
Yeah.
Well, Martin, I want to thank you as always for the commentary, for putting some clarity on some of the issues. Any closing remarks as we look to wrap things up?
No, well, the thing is, I mean, I would certainly like to see the idea of us looking at implementing special prosecutor courts for these high-profile matters. The same way that it's done in other countries, whereby you assign a judge and you have a special court set aside. I think if, for instance, the Piarco matter, if we had set up a court maybe down in Chagaramas and you assign a magistrate dedicated to that matter alone, and you say, look, we are sitting from day to day to day, so everybody clear your diaries, clear your calendars, we are starting on such and such date, and we are proceeding. I think that's the way we are going to get things done. But when you have these matters on the list of a magistrate who has 100 other matters on a daily basis to contend with, how do we realistically expect these matters to be, completed, particularly when they are so, heavy and voluminous? So we have to look at that as probably a way to avoid ending up in these kind of embarrassing scenarios.
Yeah. Thanks as always, Martin. We'll touch base soon.
It's a pleasure.
We come back and all the best. We come back and we touch base with Edie from the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association. Edie, up next.